Jonathan has a rare condition called Lowe Syndrome. It's a genetic condition, it's ultra rare, and it's an X-linked condition, which means it's generally passed from a carrier mother to an affected son, although in some families what happens is it's called a de novo mutation, which means it happens as a one-off event and it would never happen again for that family. But in our family, I'm a carrier for Lowe Syndrome and I passed that faulty gene on to my son. Lowe Syndrome broadly affects three organ systems: the eyes, the brain and the kidney, and for that reason it's called oculocerebrorenal syndrome of Lowe, and it was first described in 1952 by a set of doctors in Boston General Hospital who discovered a group of boys with the same symptoms, and the senior doctor being Charles Lowe, he got to name the syndrome. The effect that Lowe Syndrome has in the family has been quite profound. Where we were living when Jonathan was born had quite patchy services, and we felt that it was important to get Jonathan correct educational services, for instance. And when it came to have his needs recorded for educational purposes, he was going to be offered a school which we disagreed with, and we looked around and decided to come to Fife on the reputation of a school that we visited for 45 minutes or so. But during that 45 minutes or so, we saw where children with different disabilities were being looked after, educated and cherished, and that's what we wanted for Jonathan. And so within a fortnight we had put our house in the market and moved 200 miles down to Fife. The consequence of that was that for about 18 months we were still paying a mortgage in our old house in Lossiemouth and renting a flat privately down in Dunfermline. That, combined with the loss of money in the sale of our house, cost us in the region of £30,000, which is money we'll never see again. But with hindsight, it's been an investment in Jonathan's education and therefore worth money. You know, it's worth every penny to us. But I resent the fact that the education in Scotland for children with additional needs, it's like a postcode lottery, and you know, you're more or less forced to go where the education is if you want to have a decent quality of education, and I find that very frustrating. There's so many things about Jonathan's school that I feel other schools could copy. I think at the heart of it we've got excellent leadership. The head teacher is just so committed to the children, and her leadership filters down through all the teaching staff. But at the heart of it, they have a partnership with parents, and so the teaching staff don't have an agenda to teach children a certain thing from the curriculum. We have a meeting every year and we discuss what the priorities for that child is that year, and that can be amended as many times as you want as you go along, and they play to the child's strengths, and it's a very successful partnership between parents and staff, and so you feel that when your child goes to school, they're looked after properly and they're educated properly. I could give you a quick example of some of the teaching methods. There was one day I was in class and there was two boys being taught. There was my son and another child who's a full-time wheelchair user. And the teacher had 4 cardboard boxes painted different colours. I think they were all crisp boxes or something like that. So it wasn't a matter of high-tech equipment. And what they were doing was offering the boys the choice of picking a box and then stacking them up in a pile and then knocking them all down again. Now, a random observation would say, well, they're just mucking about. But what they were actually doing was offering the boys a choice. They were talking about colours, they were talking about numbers, construction and deconstruction, and the fact that at the end of each activity, both boys were very excited about what they were doing and engaged, and they wanted to do it again. And so that sort of elaborated curriculum, I think, is very important for our kids because it teaches them at their level. Jonathan being in the family has meant that I've had to give up full-time work to be his full-time carer. And before Jonathan was born, I was working in pathology services in the NHS. I'm a graduate biochemist, and so although I wasn't earning wildly big wage, we've lost that wage for the last 17 years. And I've estimated that would roughly be £250,000, which that's a significant amount by any estimation to lose. On top of that, I won't have an occupational pension, and to substitute that, the amount of carers allowance I've earned in that same time period is a total of 33,000, and that's not per year, that's for 17 years' work. And I think that's quite an indictment on how carers are valued in this country. I would estimate that if Jonathan had been put into permanent residential care, the cost would easily top £1 million, and that's not including any therapy costs, which we also do at home. It gets physiotherapy, occupational therapy, speech and language therapy, and therapy for children who are blind. I think that the biggest impact that Lowe syndrome has on Jonathan is his learning disabilities. He probably functions at the age of a toddler, but he's not quite as savvy. So, for instance, he doesn't have any sense of danger, so he needs supervision 24 hours a day to make sure he doesn't get himself into trouble. He also has motor skill problems, so it means that he can't dress himself or brush his teeth or wash his hands. And probably even if he could, he probably couldn't understand what you were asking of him. So there is a lot of care around him. He's doubly incontinent, so we spend a lot of time doing personal care for him. And then the rest of the time is just occupying his interests, to try and get him to learn different things. This year he's learned how to switch lights on and off, and that can be quite amusing because he demands control of his environment. And while that's frustrating and annoying for us, while we're watching TV and he wants to switch something off, it's nice to see how he's improving in his skills. Jonathan takes 4 different medications multiple times a day. Some of that is for his kidney function and some of that is for epilepsy. Thankfully his epilepsy is well controlled, but he'll stay on that medication for a long time, certainly through puberty, to see if the seizures will settle okay until he's an adult, and then talk about withdrawing that. The kidney medication is essential salts that he is actually losing in his urine. So his kidney problem isn't one of dialysis, it's a chemical balance problem. But that also means he can't be fasted from fluids for any reason, and so we're always making sure he's got plenty to drink. I think we're at the stage in his life where most services we've got as we like them. I think the thing that concerns us presently is his transition into adult services, because we've kind of got an equilibrium of services now, but it's very difficult to predict how those services will work for him. I think we've spent a long time cultivating good, positive relationships with other professionals and having a really open dialogue, and in essence, a lot of the time training them about Lowe syndrome. And I think, by and large, professionals recognise your expertise and they want to work with you. And that's why I would certainly encourage parents who are newly diagnosed and people who are sort of new to the care game, to take your time and get to know your professional so that you can work as a team and get the best, out of the system for your child. I would say we've had mixed experiences with health professionals, mostly to the good, which is a nice thing to report. We spend a lot of time being able to educate them on Lowe syndrome, and those who are receptive to it are the most helpful, because they appreciate that they don't know a lot about the syndrome and they take their cue from you as being the expert in managing your own child's condition. There's been a couple of occasions where health professionals have been really obstructive, and sometimes that's because they assume that they know more than you about the syndrome. And for instance, Jonathan once had a seizure, and I knew it was neurologically based because of the background of the condition. But once he got to the hospital, the consultant was very adamant that this seizure was caused by a metabolic imbalance and wanted to put a drip into Jonathan's arm immediately. And the implication behind that was that I hadn't administered his kidney medications that morning, and I knew that wasn't the case, that he'd all his medications on board. And so at one point we were almost nose to nose arguing about this drip, and I thought that was very strange to argue with a doctor, because you see them as figures of authority, but I knew what I was talking about and I refused to be cowed by something that he was telling me. So we decided to negotiate, and I said, well, if you take a blood test and make sure that the electrolytes are good, then we'll talk about it afterwards. And that's what he did. He took a blood test and the results were fine, so he didn't need to have a drip in his arm. And then later the doctor apologised to me for not recognising that I knew what I was talking about, and I apologised to him for shouting. But it's strange that it took a shouting match to actually achieve what I needed to for Jonathan. I think one of the things that I would like to see is some kind of scheme where, carers maybe carried some kind of card or something to show that they had a certain expertise, because, for example, Jonathan carries an emergency protocol, which his metabolic doctor wrote from years ago, and it means that if we arrive at a strange accident emergency who don't have Jonathan's notes to hand, would be able to read quickly what his protocol for fasting and things like that would be. And it always amused us that they were prepared to read a bit of paper from a doctor they might not have met and believe it, and yet they wouldn't take the word of the parents who are standing right there in front of them. As Jonathan's care, I feel that there's a lack, certainly in the UK, of specialist centres for people with rare genetic diseases. The kind of likelihood of meeting a professional who will have met another child with that same condition is really unusual, and that's very frustrating, because it means every professional you meet, you're having to teach them over and over again. Now, I can appreciate there's so many rare diseases that professionals can't take the time to learn everything about every syndrome, but I feel that there should be some kind of centre of excellence where parents and patients can be referred, and cultivate more links and more networking about these rare conditions. Because certainly the first time I met another parent with a child with Lowe Syndrome, it was mind-blowing, because you just felt there was someone who understood what you were going through. And I think that's what we miss in the UK. There's like a lack of networking to get parents and patients together. I think a lot of the organisations that I'm involved with, their importance becomes for us in terms of supplying information about services and things like that. I think we're kind of isolated by the fact that there are only another 2 people in Scotland with Lowe Syndrome, so it doesn't really matter how well connected the organisation is. At the end of it, we're on our own, But certainly there are other conditions where they're more numerous, and organisations are key to helping parents connect with each other. And I think their strength is, being able to forge links with parents and give them good solid information. Plan for Jonathan's future is difficult. It's difficult to explain or even express that when you move from the comfort zone of children's services into the adult world, it's quite scary for parents, because there's not always necessarily a speciality that mirrors something that's available in children's services. And so I feel the next few years we're going to have to renegotiate and meet a whole new field, a whole new team of specialists, and re-educate them and educate them into what Lowe Syndrome is about. I think that's not necessarily anything to do with it being a rare disease. I think it's just anything that children with disabilities moving into the adult service team find anyway. The funny thing for us, though, that Lowe Syndrome is life-limiting and life-threatening, so there was always a part of us that maybe didn't really appreciate that it would make it to adulthood, and so that leaves us in a bit of a, we're in a strange territory that we were having to negotiate something we didn't really expect to do. Okay, it's a nice place to be, but again, you have to negotiate that path yourself. It's not made easy for you in the first place.